All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Closing the Golden Doors, the Immigration Act of 1924. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Senior Genealogist Rhonda R. McClure. Rhonda is a nationally recognized professional genealogist and lecturer. Before joining American Ancestors in 2006, she ran her own genealogical business for 18 years. She was a contributing editor for Heritage Quest magazine, Biography magazine, and was a contributor to the History Channel magazine and American History magazine. In addition to numerous articles, she is the author of 12 books, including the award-winning Complete Idiot's Guide to Online Genealogy, Finding Your Famous and Infamous Ancestors, and Digitizing Your Family History. She is also the editor of the recently released 6th edition of the Genealogist Handbook for New England Research. Her areas of expertise include immigration and naturalization, late 19th and early 20th century urban research, New England, the Midwest, Southern, German, Italian, Scottish, Irish, French Canadian, and New Brunswick research. So from the mid-19th through the early 20th century, waves of European immigrants arrived on American shores seeking new opportunities. Unfortunately, this period also ushered in anti-Semitic and prejudiced attitudes towards these immigrants, which culminated in the passing of the Immigration Act of 1924. In this lecture, we will discuss the historical context of the act, how it shaped immigration records, and how the closing of the Golden Doors impacted the lives of your ancestors. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There's an optional syllabus available for purchase that accompanies today's webinar. Your purchase helps support us in providing this and other free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and YouTube channel. So if you miss something on today's first listen, not to worry, you can always review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, please welcome Rhonda.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now I am going to have to confess to you all that having the opportunity to give this lecture is probably like a major excitement for me. I am a geek when it comes to immigration and naturalization. And so I have been studying about it for many, many years. And every time I do a lecture on immigration, I just get deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole. So before we actually talk about the Immigration Act of 1924, we're going to touch on some background that is going to hopefully help you to understand why things kind of turned the way they did. So at the earliest, by the 1900s, immigration was certainly running at an all-time high. The influx of those who looked and dressed differently from the Anglo-Saxons was beginning to cause concerns among some of those who had, were in the United States, as well as those who could trace their ancestry back for many, many generations. Settlement patterns were also suggesting a sense of isolation among certain ethnicities. In this period, starting in the late 1800s, roughly, the late 1880s and 1890s, there was this kind of shift in the immigrants who were coming in, but more importantly, in how they were identified. Now, the terms old immigrants and new immigrants are within the scholarly genre no longer used, but they can be found in many publications and references when discussing those immigrants who came before 1882, who were our old immigrants, and those who came after and into the 1900s. So the old immigrants came from places like the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and other countries of the Northwest Europe. Meanwhile, what we saw here was this new influx of what they called new immigrants who appeared less likely to assimilate into American life, preferring supposedly to congregate together apart from others in America. They were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were bringing with them their new religions and new to the United States, their differences in manner, style of dress, and so on. They also had a lot of the men who were coming in who were unskilled and were often coming here in an effort to just work and make money. And then they had plans to go back to their home country. So they were not coming here to settle. And those who were looking for jobs here kind of felt like these unskilled men who would work for cheaper were stealing jobs away from them with no intention of coming here and supporting our country. The reason I think that a lot of individuals did feel that the new immigrants were, quote, congregating together had a large part to do with the fact that they were concentrated in industrial centers. So obviously, beginning in roughly 1882-ish, when the Immigration Act of 1882 came out, we do certainly start to see a major increase in the number of immigrants who are arriving. And in addition to having some issues with the Chinese immigrants, there were a lot of other things that were starting to just nudge the golden door a little bit. These included, among other things, the alien contract labor laws of 1885 and 1887. Between 1890 and 1914, we see a massive third immigration wave of numbers that we had not seen up to this point. Also in 1906, we see the inception of the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and it has done a study in 1905 that saw some fraud and some things that were not consistent. And so they've decided we're going to just take over. We're going to standardize everything from passenger lists and naturalization forms and everything, head taxes. It was all going to fall under the INS. As things are going along, there is concern, of course, about the immigrants. And so in 1907, there is an commission that is assigned to look into, quote, the immigration issue. And so that's going to take 3 years. As I mentioned, there were a lot of people prior to 1906 who were involved in how people came in, how they were treated, whether or not they were taxed, and so on. And so we had state boards or commissions who would enforce the immigration laws, and it was under the direction of the U.S. Treasury Department at the time. So it hasn't always been INS. So in this time frame under the Treasury, it was really under customs collectors. So they often cared a lot more about the baggage you were bringing on board rather than the people who were coming along. We see, though, during that 1890 to 1914 timeframe, we have approximately 15 million immigrants who are coming in just those 24 years. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, they are coming from Southern and Eastern European countries such as Austria-Hungary, Greece, Italy, Romania, Russia, and Turkey. And as a result, they begin to stir up nativist vibes or feelings among those who are already living here in America. So after the creation of the INS in 1906 and the the investigation by them in 1905, it does show that there is a lot of variation both in laws and requirements by each state and at each port. And so now that INS has taken over, the first thing they want to do is have a study of what's going on. And that's sort of where we get this the Dillingham Commission. So the Dillingham Commission was actually created by Act of Congress on the 20th of February, 1907, and it was headed by William P. Dillingham. He was a senator, and it was to examine the immigrant question. This commission consisted of, or was to consist of, 3 senators that were to be appointed by the President of the Senate, 3 members of the House of Representatives who were appointed by the Speaker of the House, and then 3 outside persons who were to be appointed by the President of the United States. Now, it was precisely because many of the immigrants who were coming in this early 1890 to early 1900s period who had elected to settle in big cities such as New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, that it was seen that they were sequestering, that they were focusing on their little communities and they did not wish to assimilate. As a result, the Dillingham Commission believed that these newly arriving immigrants were not only clustering together by ethnicity, but were going to actually refuse to assimilate and become American citizens. The Dillingham Commission itself had as the chairman William P. Dillingham, thus how it gets its name. Also among the senators were Henry Cabot Lodge. Asbury C. Latimer didn't last very long. He died, unfortunately, on the 20th of February, 1908, and he was replaced by Anselm J. McClure, who himself died the 22nd of December, 1908, and was replaced by Leroy Percy, who was appointed the 16th of March, 1910. The House of Representatives were Benjamin F. Howell, William S. Bennett, and John L. Burnett. And then the president appointed 3 individuals, Charles P. Neal, Jeremiah W. Jenks, and William R. Wheeler. 2 of our senators are shown here, their photographs, William Paul Dillingham and Henry Cabot Lodge, and neither one of them looked favorably on the immigrants. William Dillingham, he was best known for his restriction of immigrants from certain countries. He wanted that. He wanted people not to be allowed to come in from certain areas. Meanwhile, Henry Cabot Lodge was a very public voice of an organization known as the Immigration Restriction League, and he argued vociferously for literacy tests for the newly arriving immigrants. Lodge was described as an argumentative snob prone to ruining polite dinner conversation by picking fights with other guests at the table and goading them into verbal combat. He believed that America's greatness as a nation relied on maintaining its essential Anglo-Saxon character. Lodge was also a prominent member of, as I mentioned, the Immigration Restriction League, who were basically a lobbying organization that was pushing for a lot of changes to who was allowed in the country. Now, the Dillingham Commission officially submitted to the Committee on Immigration their findings on December 5th, 1910, and the report was printed in 1911. It actually consisted of 41 volumes containing statistical overviews, analysis, all things topic-wise relating to immigrant occupations, living conditions, education, legislation at the state as well as the federal level, and social and cultural organizations. Volume 3 that you see here is what a lot of people use because it was sort of the highlights. This is completely statistical review, a lot of charts, a lot of tables, and was the design, or they hoped would show that we need to close the door. That's not exactly what happened, but that's what they were hoping would happen. So this particular volume itself is 587 pages long. So we're not talking just, a couple of pages. And it was stuffed with tons of tables similar to this, along with other statistics that the committee believed would support their hypothesis that the immigrants who were arriving in the 1900s were of a lower intelligence and generally were going to harm the good aspects of the United States. I did mention the Immigration Restriction League, of which Henry Cabot Lodge was a member. He, however, was not a founder. It was founded in 1894 by 3 Boston Brahmin Harvard alumni. They all graduated from the class of 1889, and they were Charles Warren, Robert de Courcy Ward, and Prescott F. Hall. Now, Warren and de Courcy Ward were Mayflower descendants, while Hall's ancestors arrived from England a little later in the 1600s. They believed that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were ethnically inferior to Anglo-Saxons. And also by this time frame, we have the Chinese exclusion law. And what you're seeing here is sort of the 20th century immigration of all of Europe is the blue line, and then the Asia totals, that almost straight line at the bottom there for China, Japan, all of the Asian countries. And number one, you can see the height of immigration in that early time frame up to roughly about 1916 when we start to see things coming down. This was the time when everybody is starting to freak out about the number of individuals who are coming in. Now, from the concerns, we end up with exclusion and literacy, but also eugenics is going to start to play a role in moving forward. So just to touch briefly, there was the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Now, one of the reasons for these Exclusion Acts had more to do with the fact that the Constitution only allowed for naturalization of free white men. And then we had, after the end of the Civil War, we had an amendment that did allow for naturalization and or citizenship to the African Americans who had been brought over as slaves and their descendants. However, because the Chinese were neither white nor African American, they could not have become naturalized citizens. And so it was felt that since they couldn't, that we needed to exclude them from being able to come over unless they were in certain categories. And so the initial Chinese Exclusion Act was in 1882. Then there was the Act of 5 July 1884 that excluded all Chinese, regardless of which country they immigrated from. They noticed that quite a few Chinese were coming into Canada and then across the border. And so that they dealt with. Then the Act of the 1st of October 1888 denied re-entry to Chinese laborers who had not returned by that date. So if they had been in the country and been allowed to be here and were considered a non-immigrant because they'd already been here, if they had gone back to visit family or whatever and didn't get back by this particular date, they weren't getting back into the United States. The Act of 5 May 1892 extended all the previous Chinese exclusion laws by 10 years. And then that was upheld with the Act of 29 April 1902, again, extending that previous Chinese exclusion laws for an additional 10 years. It's also about this time that we see the opening of Angel Island. And a lot of people aren't as familiar with Angel Island as they are with Ellis Island. It is the Ellis Island of the West. And it was opened in 1910. Approximately 175,000 Chinese came through Angel Island and were processed. Now, unlike Ellis Island, where most people either were, allowed to enter the United States the day they arrived, or at the most, maybe they were detained a couple of days to up to a week, depending on if there were issues about where they were going, somebody coming to get them, etc. The average detention on Angel Island was 2 to 3 weeks. That was like the average for everybody. Some were actually held for a few months, and there are a few who were forced to remain there for nearly 2 years, trying to get themselves accepted and allowed into the country. The result of these Chinese exclusion acts did prompt some creative aspects for the Chinese. I give them props for doing this. So if people were already here, if the Chinese were already here prior to the initial acts and the extension of those acts, if they had family back in China, those individuals would be allowed in because they were related to somebody who was already here. As a result, what we found was the creation of paper sons and paper daughters. The individuals trying to come into the US who were trying to use this loophole would spend the bulk of their trip from China coming into the US literally studying everything they needed to know about the person that they were supposedly related to. As a reason, and then they were supposed to get rid of like all the papers and stuff that had all the cheat notes on it. But as a result, strict and detailed interrogations resulted in the paper sons, like they knew they were going to get grilled when they got in because it was known that this was happening. So you had to have everything down pat about the family tree, information about hometowns, so much more. And if you had pictures that could be shown of like, see, this is my uncle, or here I am with my uncle, that was all the better. One of the things that the Immigration Restriction League was very, vocal about were literacy tests. They felt that if we could force individuals to prove that they were literate, that there would be so many people who would not be able to, pass this test that they would all have to go back home. It was originally suggested in 1891, and within Congress itself, there were acts that were passed in 1896, 1913, and 1915. All of these acts, when they were presented to the President of the United States, refused to sign. Eventually, it was again included in the Immigration Act of February 5, 1917. This act was presented again to the President of the United States. He refused to, at that point, Woodrow Wilson was the president. He refused to sign it. He said, I'm not going to sign it. Same as his predecessors. It actually went back to Congress, and this is one of those situations where Congress repassed this act and overruled the president, and it went into effect. Now, the primary test, primary literacy test, was for an immigrant to read a passage from the Bible in their native language. So we're not talking about individuals having to speak English or know some fancy mathematic thing or whatever. No, this was, they would give you this card and you had to read your language. And as you can see here, there are actually, these two are samples of the Italian cards. They didn't all have the same verse. So basically, when like an entire family would come and they had to pass this test, you had to be, I think it was 16 and over, had to read the cards. It wasn't like, the one that could read could then kind of help those who couldn't. Everybody was getting different, so you didn't know which passage you were going to get out of these cards. And so as a result, there really was no way to cheat on this. It was believed that these literacy tests, in other words, reading from these cards, would decrease immigration by 25%. Also part of the Act of 1917, of course, was the literacy test. It also described what was the most stringent general immigration law the country had ever passed. So really, this is where we're not just nudging, we've probably got the door about halfway closed at this point. It expanded the Chinese Exclusion Act to include countries in an area called the Asiatic barred zone, which I'll describe in a second. And it also extended the deportation window from 1 year to 5 years. So if you got in, you get off the boat, you're welcomed in with open arms, and you go off on your merry way, and you end up on some kind of welfare, you get sick, you get put in jail, any of these things. And within those 5 years, they could then arrest you, send you back to, in many cases, New York City, and deport you. In her book, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, the epic struggle over American immigration, 1924 to 1925, Jia-Lin Yang described the Immigration Act of 1917 as this most stringent general immigration law the country had ever passed. Little did she know what was coming. So as you can see on this map, the upper left one is what was the Asiatic barred zone according to the Immigration Act of 1917. And I've included this little map because, let's face it, this area has undergone a lot of border changes, etc. But what you can see is all of the areas, including parts of China, all of the little islands, and all the way over to Turkey on the west. What you will notice is not part of the Asiatic barred zone at this point is Japan. And part of that has to do with what was known as a gentleman's agreement between Japan and the president of the United States at the time, where certain Japanese would be allowed to come in. The Japanese did consider themselves to be of a higher quality than those in China and some of the other Asian areas. And so at one point, when California actually put the Japanese students out of a white school and into an Asian school, the Japanese took exception. They were offended that this had happened, and it resulted in a big hoopla. So at this point, Japanese are still allowed to come in. Okay. We've bandied about certain terms of ethnically inferior and whatnot, and not as intelligent, and so on and so forth. Harry Laughlin is going to be heavily involved as we go forward. He was a one-time high school principal. In 1910, he is actually going to be asked by Charles Davenport, himself an evolutionary biologist, to become the superintendent of Davenport's research facility in Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. At the time, it was known as one of the world's foremost research facilities for biology, but eventually it is going to be renamed as the Eugenics Record Office. Now, Harry Laughlin is going to become the superintendent, and ultimately he will get a Doctor of Science degree from Princeton. However, he is going to be very vocal, and he is going to testify before the House Immigration Committee. And he has won over, especially those in both the House and the Senate, who agree with this eugenics movement, that these Southern and Eastern immigrants are inferior and not good. And so Laughlin is going to actually be appointed by Albert Johnson, the chair of the Immigration Committee, as the committee's own, as he describes him, expert eugenics agent, so that the committee could ask him to conduct further studies. Like, basically, he gets like the bat phone. they got a question, they can call Harry here. And eugenics in the early 20th century was seen as a way to improve the world by perfecting humanity. And it actually, it gets its start from Gregor Mendel's groundbreaking research into the different varieties of peas in the 1840s. However, over time, it is going to morph, and it's going to get away from the understanding of the things that Mendel discovered, and it's going to morph into we want people to be better, we want a cleaner race, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of the volumes that was written by Charles Davenport, who was the head of the Eugenics Record Office. And let's just say that in especially 1911, when this was published, there was nothing known about being politically correct. When it comes to the Italians, he is pointing out that the southern immigrants from southern Italy are 5 or 6 times greater than those of northern Italy. And further down, he says it is the South Italians that we generally have in mind when we speak of Italians. 80% of those who come are males, and a quarter of them return each year to their homes. He talks about them, being immigrants from the former country are darker and doubtless have derived part of their blood from Greece and Northern Africa. So we can already start to see the racism that is starting to creep in here. Meanwhile, for the Jewish, he's got issues on them. Statistics indicate that the crimes of Hebrews are chiefly gainful offenses, especially thieving and receiving stolen goods, while they rarely commit offenses of personal violence. And then he goes on to say there is no question that taken as a whole, the hordes of Jews that are now coming to us from Russia and the extreme southeast of Europe, with their intense individualism and ideals of gain at the cost of any interest, represent the opposite extreme from the early English and the more recent Scandinavian immigration, with their ideals of community life in the open country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So naturally, we've passed this 1917 law. We are now about to experience the Great War, the World War I, and everybody's going to come back and be all the more concerned, and they want to control the flow. I found everybody thinks of the Saturday Evening Post, the magazine, and a lot of us, our introduction to it, especially in this time frame, is that they had those, warm family pictures on their covers, and everything is rosy. Interestingly enough, I did find this particular entry from the Saturday Evening Post that was published on 14 February 1920, called "The Rising Irish Tide" by Kenneth L. Roberts. Now, despite its title, author Kenneth L. Roberts, who was a journalist who turned historical novelist, so he started out as a journalist and he was involved in the war. He spends the first half of this multi-page article talking more about immigration in general. He begins the article by describing just what 1 million people is to the unskilled mind, and then mentions that at the time of the writing of this article, there are 14 million individuals in the United States who were born in a foreign country. So he spends the first 2 or 3 paragraphs literally describing what your mind has to go through to really comprehend what 1 million people are. And he does this because during the World War I, the United States sent 1 million soldiers over to fight. And so he's using that as sort of his benchmark. And eventually, though, he does get to the issue that was being mentioned again by many people at this time, that where the people are emigrating from, in the section that he titles "Lumps in the Melting Pot." He starts out with "The new immigration is made up of people from Eastern and Southern Europe." I swear everybody took this all from like one bullet point. If they'd had PowerPoint, this would have been a bullet point. People from Eastern and Southern Europe, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Italy, Yugoslavia, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Spain, and Turkey. Since 1883, nearly 4/5 of our immigration has come from these countries. In 1914, 9/10 of our immigration belonged to the new immigration. They came to a great extent with the intention of making as much money as they could in as short a time as they could, and of going back home to settle down when they had saved sufficient quantity of money. More than 1/3 of them have been unable to read or write, and generally speaking, they have been very difficult to assimilate. And thus we begin. So in December of 1920, the House actually passes a bill to close immigration, to suspend immigration for everybody for 2 years. Not surprisingly, this particular bill is going to be put forth by Albert Johnson, who we will meet in a moment. The Senate does not support this bill. However, Senator Dillingham does come up and he proposes a compromise, which is going to become the Immigration Act of 1921. So this is our first attempt at a quota. It was passed on May 19th, 1921. It said there would be an annual quota for each nationality group. So, based on what country you were coming from, of the number of foreign-born persons of that national origin as enumerated in the 1910 census. So basically, if the people in the census were born in, say, Spain, said that they were born in Spain, then 3% of those individuals would be given quotas from Spain to come over after this act was passed. It also capped the immigrants at 355,000, and they kept the Asiatic barred zone immigrants. They're still denied. It did exempt some certain classes. It did, but it didn't. So yes, if you were certain individuals, such as an alien returning from a temporary visit abroad, if you were among these professionals here who are identified, actors, artists, singers, lecturers, nurses, ministers, professors, learned people of learned professions, and or domestic servants, then technically you were not part of the quota. But there was a little twist there. So if you came and got off the ship and you were one of these individuals on the left, you would still be allowed into the United States if the quota had already been met for that month, which is basically 20% of the year's total for the specified origin. However, so, if that quota had been met, they're not going to deny you and say, no, you got to go home and come try again. So you'd be allowed in. However, if you came and the quota had not yet been met, then your arrival still counted against the quota. So that meant somebody who didn't fit these situations on the left could be denied later in the month if some of these individuals had come in and taken those slots. Preference was also given, and I understand this one, to wives, parents, brothers, sisters, children under 18 years of age, and fiancés of US citizens. So, people who maybe have already naturalized and become US citizens, aliens of the US who have applied for their citizenship. So probably those who have put in their first papers, that declaration of intent. Also, persons eligible for US citizenship who served in the US military or naval from any time between April 6, 1917 and November 11th, 1918, the end of World War I, who were honorably discharged. The thinking being that if this individual who served for the United States, even though he wasn't considered a US citizen at the time, obviously if he's fighting for our country, he's a good guy, so his relatives could come in. Now, The Quota Act of 1921 was considered an emergency measure. This was like a gut reaction to what was going on, especially after the war had ended. There was a lot of fear that the poor from the countries in Europe were going to pick up and en masse move to the US. It was only supposed to last for a year. However, May 11th, 1922, it was extended for an additional 2 years and was thus set to expire on June 30th of 1924. This, of course, as we get into late 23, early 24, is going to prompt a lot of new bills to replace it. The problem, though, had to do with coming up with a formula that everyone could accept. You had a lot of people in Congress who were saying, no, we've got to do this, we've got to favor this group, we've got to do that. Also, you had business leaders who were really, really afraid of losing their cheap labor of these individuals who were coming over who were desperate for a job. Enter the 68th Congress. The 68th Congress ran from 1923 to 1920, the end of 1925 into 26. And this here is Terry Laughlin's report to the House committee. It was so accepted and they were just so happy with it, especially Albert Johnson, who was head of the committee, that he told them to leave the various charts and forms and whatnot that had been presented in a bigger form that had been put up on the walls. Those stayed up for a long time. Johnson insisted that many, many copies of this report be printed so that everybody could have it and they could take it. And of course, not surprisingly, this 106-page publication was full of tables and conclusions that supported his summary that Eastern and Southern Europeans were bad for America. So, this was, again, feeding in, but it was science. So it wasn't racism. This was hard science, supposedly, and thus backed up what everybody knew. In February of 1924, on the front page of Section 8 of the New York Times, there was an entire article about 100 years of immigration that was written by then Labor Secretary James J. Davis. And at that point, immigration fell under the Department of Labor. Interestingly enough, this chart that I have cut out of the newspaper and kind of put up here for you guys, it was printed upside down, like literally like the numbers and everything were backwards. And I couldn't quite tell if that was just a mistake. I think, though, perhaps because the higher peaks between 1905 and 1915 over on the far right probably look way worse if they are dipping down because, let's face it, up, positive, down, negative. And so he, it was a whole page of why we can't have these people. In his book, in Yang's book, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, she said that Secretary Davis actually used faulty data in his article. The numbers here in the chart are accurate. However, his conclusions and some of the things he relied on in the written part were faulty. Okay, so the 68th Congress starts to meet in 1923 through the end of 1925, and they urge modifications in the immigration policy. We see 6 bills that suggest suspension of all immigration, 15 bills suggesting additions to the classes of aliens who are subject to deportation, and at least 8 bills in regard to the Quota Act of 1921. Now, among the bills suggesting suspension of immigration, 1 bill suggested shutting everything down for 5 years, 2 bills suggested a 6-year suspension, and 1 went so far as to say, no, we should shut everything down for 10 years. Of the bills regarding the Quota Act of 1921, 1 suggested repealing the act completely. Several wanted to extend its operation, so just to keep it going. Some did want to liberalize it a little bit, so not make it as strict, whereas others were depending on a a harder line on immigration. So let's meet Albert Johnson. He is the chair of the House Immigration Committee. He was a congressman from Washington State. He actually becomes part of the Congress. He's elected and is the one who proposed the closing of immigration for 2 years that was presented in 1920. He is known as one of the co-authors of what becomes the Approved Act of 1924. He is joined by David Aiken Reed. Reed is a Republican senator from Pennsylvania. So Johnson is our House representative. He is also Republican. And then we have Reed here, who was a senator from Pennsylvania. He served from 1922 to 1935. When he wasn't serving or serving in the military, he was a lawyer by profession, and he is the second author or co-author of the Approved Act. And so very often, instead of Immigration Act of 1924, you may also hear it referred to as the Johnson-Reed Act. All right, little background legislative history on the Immigration Act. Johnson introduces his House Bill 6540 on the 1st of February, 1924, and Reed in the Senate, he presents the Senate Bill 2576 about 19 days later. There's some discussion, a lot of debate and whatnot over 6540, and eventually it sort of gets passed, and then the immediate next thing that is said is we need to start all over again. And so Johnson presents the House Bill 7995. That is going to pass the House on 12 April 1924. The Senate suspends indefinitely at 2576. They have made major amendments to the House Bill 7995. However, getting both sides to agree is going to be a little tricky, and they request a conference with the House to discuss this, and ultimately they come to an agreement with a bill that they recognize as that can be presented to the president, that has passed both chambers of the Congress on 19 May 1924, and it is signed into law by Calvin Coolidge on the 31st of May 1924. Amongst the myriad of pages in the congressional record that have debates on the yes, you can, no, you can't, is this racism, is this, there are at one point some estimates based on part of the Act of 1924 that wants to take 2% of the census plus 100 as they appear in the census of 1890. And as opposed to the census of 1910, in the hopes that, again, it is going to eliminate Eastern and Southern Europe. And you can see that Germany, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, the Irish Free State, they are obviously, a lot of people are coming in from there. You can see, however, that in the 1890 census, people from Greece, Hungary, and Italy, especially Greece, Hungary, Iceland, they have little tiny people, like just a few people. Imagine getting 2% of that. And so there was a reason for choosing that census of 1890. However, because the wording of the act is going to talk about this, if we go with the 1890 and we just sit there, everybody's going to say it's racist. So the idea is that it becomes this national origins thinking. But if we're going to do that, then we have to have some acknowledgement of what we consider Americans. So early drafts did focus only on the immigrants. However, we do ultimately pivot to this origins theory. This was going to require inclusion of those born in America in the statistical outcomes of how many could come from other countries. It's also going to require a great deal of time to compile those statistics and figure out the system. There were two ways that they could define the national origins quota. They could attempt to trace the genealogies of 120 million Americans to determine ethnic background. If they did that, we'd all have family trees. We would know all the way back. Obviously, that wasn't going to be feasible. So instead, there was the other option, which was to determine the weight of each nationality to the American population as a whole. Now, this took as its basis the 1790 census, then it traced additions to by subsequent immigration, and had quite a few things that they were figuring out. The computations, as they were supplied by the Census Bureau to Congress, did look as far back as 1610, and the increase of population. You can see there that up until 1780, there is no data really of who the immigrants were, et cetera, because we don't start to keep censuses until 1790. And even that one, we have very little because, it was the first. It barely even identified everybody in the household. So now we are literally going to close the door. The National Origins Act of 1924, yes, it was heavily weighted to limit the Southern and Eastern Europeans from gaining entry. The National Origins section of that act, that would become fully operational in 1929. The act itself capped the total immigration outside of the Western Hemisphere to 150,000. And that's important, because basically what that meant was the United States, with Canada to the top and Mexico to the bottom, that was the Western Hemisphere to them. And, Canadians and Mexicans could come and go as they pleased. But what it ultimately did was it averaged out to 5 Northwestern Europeans to every 1 Southeastern European. The initial 1924 quotas were submitted again as part of this process of the debating and discussing the act. And there was shown the present law, then there was the 2% of 1890 with a minimum of 100. You can see that there are quite a few countries there that have 100 or just a little over 100. And this was reported to Congress in the Congressional Record for the 68th Congress, pages 8635 to 8636. And so again, I'm not sure why that got duplicated, but we'll go on. Okay, so ultimately, with the announcement that there is new legislation, the bill that has been, the Senate-sponsored bill, basically it's the bill from both of them, we get this map in, again, the New York Times on the 27th of April, 1924, showing how the immigration was coming on the left presently and how it would be affected on the right. I actually took those 2 images and I kind of color coded some of the items, not everything. If it was above 50,000, I really didn't pay attention. And there were others that were already under, between 30 and 50,000 that were not, I wasn't as worried about. I picked specific countries to call attention to, including Italy, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Russia. And you can see that Poland and Italy, under the 1921 quota law, were allowed between 30 and 50,000 individuals to come into the US, and Russia and Czechoslovakia were between 10 and 30,000. With the new quota law, now you can see even Germany is directly affected because it is no longer above 50,000. It is now in the 30 to 50,000 range. And Italy, Czechoslovakia, and Russia are now in the 1,000 to 5,000 range, and Poland hangs on strong with 5 to 10,000. So dramatic decreases of individuals, and that would be true of Yugoslavia and all the other places below Russia as well. The national origins provision, this is found in section 11 under numerical limitations. It said that it had to start beginning the 1st of July, 1927. numbered bearing the same ratio to 150,000 as the number of inhabitants in the continental United States in 1920, having that national origin number as it compared to the overall inhabitants of the US who were considered to be American. The calculations for this were to be made by the Secretaries of State, Commerce, and Labor jointly. Of course, they're going to delegate that task to 6 statistical experts throughout their 3 departments, with Joseph Hill, who was on the served in the Census Bureau as the chairman. They are going to become known as the Quota Board. Now, tabulating the origins. First thing we have to do is we have to subtract out the Negro, Asiatic, and Indian individuals. And because the Asiatics can't become, they can't get nationalized, so they don't count. They're part of the barred zone. The Negroes and Indians, the Negroes were brought here. That's a whole other thing. And then we have our Native Americans. Then they separated the remaining people into 2 classifications, what were called native stock, those descended from people in the US before 1790, and immigrant stock, those descended from people who came to the US after 1790. It did rely on the censuses from 1790 to 1890. They also did rely on the colonial information as published in A Century of Population Growth that was published in 1909. And it predominantly included information and statistics that were drawn from the censuses from 1790 to 1900. It also devoted early pages to the information specifically on the colonial period. In the publication that was done by the Quota Board, they classified the 1790 population into nationality groups by examining the surnames as reported in that first census. And the Quota Board itself, when they went before Congress, stated that the only things that they had taken out of A Century of Population Growth was the early colonial stuff, since there was no other resource available to them. The actual papers of the Quota Board are available at the National Archives. They are found here. They are not online. So yes, I am already planning my next trip to DC so I can take a look at them. And they consist of 2 linear feet. It's roughly about 5 boxes of material. And as reported to the Congress, again in the congressional record, now we have what we suspect will be the national origins under the 150,000 limit proviso. And now we have a lot of people who are losing some who are gaining some, but overall, unless you are, Western, Northern, your numbers are going down. And here we see additional ones for like Poland and some other areas. And then the Senate document that actually had the quotas that were published as of 1927. So in other words, this was a Senate document that literally said, these are our numbers based on the 1924 Act. And I kind of combined those numbers to show you for just a select group of countries. Austria is going from 1921, they've got 7,342. 2% of 1890 was going to be 999. National origins, according to 1924, 1,840. This was kind of an estimate. Then we see the stuff that was in the 1927 report. And one of the things that I did do was during the earlier filed table, Great Britain and Ireland actually included what became the Irish Free State. So although it looks like Great Britain and Ireland take this massive hit in the 1927 report, it's only because now Ireland, has the Republic of Ireland. So I combined those 2 numbers and made those into italics to show what was really coming from that area.
Right. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for that excellent lecture this afternoon. We'll be getting to all of your questions that have been coming in. We have some good questions here. But first, I just wanted to highlight some upcoming events that we have. So first, we have here our online seminar, Using Probate Records in Family History Research. This will be taking place the next 3 Wednesdays, so May 29th, June 5th, and the 12th. And that will be presented by David Allen Lambert and Rhonda as well, and also our colleague Melanie McComb. And then on May 30th, Rhonda is giving another lecture, this time on Louisiana research, go-to published resources. So that should be a great one to check out. And then finally here, later that same evening on May 30th, we will be having an author event. The author Tyler Binder, with his book Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. And this will be moderated by our genealogist, Melanie McComb. You can learn more about these and all of our upcoming events at americanancestors.org/events. All right, so now let's go ahead and turn to your questions. So first here, Rhonda, we have one that came in from someone who asks, did women have to pass the literacy test required in the 1917 legislation?
To the best of my knowledge, everybody who was over the age of 16, like 16 and up, had to pass. Again, it was designed to eliminate anybody who was illiterate or would not be, quote, smart enough to live in the US. And so everybody was supposed to, just as they underwent, the health inspections and whatnot.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Then a question here, was there such a thing as an immigrant being sponsored? If so, at what time period and what was involved?
So sponsorship did play a role, and this was largely for individuals who were considered that they would likely become a public charge. This starts as we start to see the mass influx, especially of the Jewish individuals who are trying to, avoid the pogroms that are going on in the Pale of Russia. And let's be honest, they are dirt poor back there, so they have nothing when they come here. And the theory was if they were poor back there, they're going to be poor here, and they're going to go, they're going to require public assistance. And so there were many times sponsoring organizations who would put up money towards a bond that would say, I guarantee this person's going to get a job. They're going to be, a suitable person that they are going to contribute to the American way of life, et cetera, and not end up on welfare, in jail, et cetera. And if that happened in the bond's years, then obviously the US government got the money. And so that is going to be most noticeable in the late 1880s up to and including like into the 19 teens and maybe even a little bit into 1920, early 1920s, because we haven't quite got like this massive quota yet. Also, the Quota Acts both are going to now require certain inspections back in the old country, which is also going to limit the people who can come as well. So less of this sponsorship thing is needed.
Great. Thank you very much. Next, we have a question here from someone who says, on the map you showed of the Asiatic barred zone, it looked like part of China, a large part of the east of China, including Hong Kong, was not in the Asiatic barred zone. Did I see that correctly? If so, was it a case like Japan where certain groups from what is now China were okay to immigrate?
So yes, you did see that correctly. And I'll be honest, I don't quite understand why parts of China were okay, other parts weren't. If you're Chinese, you're Chinese. But the map as it was drawn, that I shared with you was what was considered the Asiatic barred zone. And it was based on, is it latitudes and longitudes? So, which is why we get that funky shape. I don't know why the Chinese who were outside that area, maybe it was because those were the bigger cities, the more productive. I'm not sure. It could have also had something to do with the numbers of individuals who were coming from the other sections of China. I haven't, this is something I need to dig into more, and maybe we'll do another lecture on it. But that map did show, yes, half of it seems to be okay.
Interesting. Thank you, Rhonda. I like the idea of another lecture on that topic. So maybe we'll do that. All right, another question here. What about Canadian citizens? Were they considered as citizens of Great Britain?
So Canadian citizens, because they were in the Western Hemisphere, had no issues whatsoever. The 1924 Act specifically said Western Hemisphere is exempt from everything. This included Canadians. It also included Mexicans coming from the different borders. And so there was no issue with them coming in. They weren't counted against any quotas whatsoever. This was all the Eastern Hemisphere that counted, which is basically everything outside of North America-ish.
Great. So I know we're in a little bit of overtime here, but we have some good questions coming in, so we'll squeeze in a couple more. So next question here, were Black immigrants from the Caribbean identified as African, and were they excluded in the Act of 1924?
So the Caribbean is, it was actually, again, I'm 90% sure was part of the Western Hemisphere, so they don't count as much. Really, this act was all about Southern and Eastern Europe. And what I'll try to do is maybe do a Vita Brevis post on the actual wording that makes it very, very clear that we are talking about across the Atlantic Ocean and all that land mass over there, because that's really what they were focused on.
Great. Thank you, Rhonda. And you mentioned our blog, Vita Brevis. For anyone who doesn't know, we do have that blog, excuse me, that our genealogists write articles for, and you can find that under the publications section of our website, Vita Brevis. All right, then we have a question, Rhonda, from someone wondering, are these quotas still in place?
Actually, no, they were in staunch in place beginning in 1924. They go up through World War II, etc. We do have the McClure Act of 1952 that starts to address refugees who are suffering, like when their islands blow up and things like that. However, the entire thing was scrapped in 1965 with the passing of that act, which basically opened up things back to the way it was before, and is, basically there were no quotas after that.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rhonda. It's looking like that's just about all we have time for today. Thank you all very much for your great questions. If you do have more specific questions about your family history research, you may consider hiring our research services team or using our chat service. The chat service puts you in direct communication with a genealogist. It's totally free and open to the public. It's available Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time. And to access that service, you'll just go to americanancestors.org/chat. And I highly recommend checking that out. It's a great resource. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with our experts at the link shown on the screen or through the QR code displayed there as well. And I'll mention, actually, Rhonda is one of our genealogists who does a lot of consultations, so you may even book a consultation with her. Thank you again for joining us today, and I want to let you know that you will have an opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on today's webinar as you exit. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Thank you again, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.